Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going deep into Carl Jung,
Oh, yeah.
specifically his concept of the self.
Okay.
You gave us these selections from Aion, researches into the phenomenology of the self,
Right.
and we're going to break it down and help you apply it to your life.
Yeah. What's really fascinating about this is that Jung didn't just see the self as like your everyday personality or your ego.
Right.
He really saw it as something much more profound, a kind of blueprint for wholeness that resides in each of us.
Yeah, that's what I really was drawn to in these excerpts.
Yeah.
This idea that there's this dupper self waiting to be discovered.
Hmm.
But it's not just sitting there passively.
Right.
It seems to be actively interacting with other powerful forces in our unconscious mind, like the shadow, animus, and archetypes.
Yeah.
And I have to admit, some of these ideas really challenged my initial understanding of Jung.
Yeah. It is a complex system. And Jung wasn't afraid to grapple with some seriously challenging concepts. Like,
Right.
take the spinning woman, for example, which Jung uses to describe the anima. He links this figure back to our mothers, but not in a literal way.
Right.
He's pointing to a deeper, more archetypal connection.
Right. And that's where it gets really interesting for me. It's like he's saying our relationship with our mothers sets the stage for how we relate to the feminine principle as a whole,
Exactly.
both within ourselves and in the world around us.
Yeah, and this brings us to a point that I think often throws people off.
Okay.
The connection Jung makes between the Antichrist and the self.
Yeah, that one really threw me for a loop.
Yeah.
I mean, talk about a loaded symbol.
It might seem bizarre at first glance, but it actually makes a lot of sense within his overall framework.
Oh,
He's
yeah.
not talking about like a literal Antichrist here.
Right.
Think of it more as an embodiment of the shadow aspect of the self.
Okay.
Those parts of ourselves that we reject or repress.
Okay, so the Antichrist becomes a symbol for everything we try to hide, even from ourselves. That's heavy stuff.
It is, and Jung's point is we can't achieve true wholeness by simply ignoring or denying these shadow elements.
Right.
We have to confront them, understand them, and ultimately integrate them into our conscious awareness.
Okay. I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together.
Yeah,
But I also want to get a clearer grasp on each of them individually.
sure.
So let's start with the self.
Okay.
What's the core idea here?
Okay.
And how does it differ from the ego?
So the self, as Jung saw it, is the totality of who you are, encompassing both your conscious and unconscious aspects.
Okay.
It's the archetype of wholeness and the driving force behind our individuation process.
So it's like the ego is just the tip of the iceberg,
Yeah,
while the self is that massive submerged part
right.
shaping and influencing everything that happens above the surface.
That's a great way to put it. And unlike Freud, who saw the unconscious as this repository of repressed desires and traumas,
Yeah.
Jung believed it held this vast reservoir of creativity, wisdom, and potential.
Mm-hmm.
He saw it as the source of our deepest aspirations and the driving force behind our personal growth.
Okay, so the unconscious isn't just like a dumping ground for the stuff we don't want to deal with.
Right.
It's actually this wellspring of positive energy and creative power.
Exactly.
Okay, that totally changes my perspective.
It does, and it also ties into Jung's fascination with alchemy.
Okay.
For alchemists, the process of transformation wasn't about eliminating the base metals.
Right.
It was about transmuting them into gold.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way, Jung believed that true individuation involved embracing and integrating the shadow rather than trying to eradicate it.
Now that you mention it, one of the excerpts that you sent over talks about the shadow as a kind of necessary evil.
Right.
I was a bit confused by that at first.
Yeah.
How can something be evil but necessary?
It's not that the shadow is inherently evil.
Okay.
Remember, Jung saw it as containing both positive and negative qualities.
Hmm.
The problem arises when we deny or repress those aspects of ourselves that we deem unacceptable.
Okay.
They don't just disappear.
Right.
They fester in the unconscious and can manifest in unhealthy ways.
So like instead of a healthy shadow, we end up with this monstrous shadow that controls us from behind the scenes.
That's one way to think about it.
Okay.
By acknowledging and integrating the shadow, we reclaim its energy and harness its potential for good.
Speaking of integration, let's dive into the anima and animus.
Okay?
You mentioned the spinning woman earlier, which I found incredibly intriguing.
Yeah.
But I'm still not quite sure I grasp what these archetypes are all about.
Think of the anima and animus as the unconscious blueprints we carry for the opposite gender.
Okay.
The anima represents the feminine principle in men, while the animus represents the masculine principle in women.
So we all have a bit of the opposite gender within us, unconsciously influencing our perceptions and behavior.
Exactly.
Right.
And these archetypes can have a profound impact on our relationships. For instance, a man who hasn't integrated his anima might project his idealized image of femininity onto his partner,
Right.
leading to disappointment and conflict when she inevitably fails to live up to that impossible standard.
Right. I can see how that would create all sorts of problems.
Yeah.
So how do we even begin to recognize these archetypes at work in our own lives?
Jung believed that our dreams, our fantasies, and projections are often populated with figures that embody these archetypal energies.
So paying attention to those inner experiences can give us clues about our own anima and animus.
Mm-hmm.
And by recognizing them, we can start to integrate them more consciously into our personalities.
Precisely.
Okay.
And that integration is key to achieving a more balanced and fulfilling sense of self. Welcome back to our deep dive into Carl Jung's concept of the self.
Yeah.
We've been unpacking some pretty dense ideas so far,
We have.
but I think we're starting to see how they all connect to this larger vision of wholeness that
Right.
Jung was so passionate about.
Yeah. And I have to say, it's really making me rethink some of my own assumptions about like who I am and what drives me.
Sure.
We were just talking about the anima and animus,
Right.
those unconscious blueprints for the opposite gender that
Yeah.
we all carry within us.
Right. And it's worth emphasizing that these archetypes aren't static or fixed.
Okay.
They evolve throughout our lives.
Right.
As we interact with the world and integrate new experiences.
That makes sense. I mean, our understanding of masculinity and femininity is constantly being shaped by like our culture, our relationships, our own personal journeys.
Exactly. And this is where Jung's concept of the shadow becomes so important.
Okay.
If we're not aware of our shadow, we tend to project those unintegrated aspects of ourselves onto others, particularly those who embody the qualities of our anima or animus.
So if I'm constantly attracted to partners who are emotionally unavailable,
Yeah.
that could be a sign that I haven't fully integrated my own anima.
It's definitely something to explore. It could be that you're unconsciously drawn to people who mirror some unresolved aspect of your own feminine nature.
That's kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah.
It's like our relationships become a mirror for our own internal struggles.
Jung would definitely agree with that.
Okay.
He saw relationships as a crucible for personal growth,
Right.
a place where we can confront our shadows and move towards greater wholeness.
And that brings us back to the whole Antichrist thing,
Yeah.
which we left hanging at the end of the last segment.
Right.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around how this figure,
Yeah.
which is so often associated with evil and destruction, can actually be a symbol for integration and wholeness.
Remember, Jung wasn't interested in literal interpretations of religious figures.
Right.
He was fascinated by the power of symbols to represent deep psychological truths.
Okay.
In the case of the Antichrist, he saw it as a powerful embodiment of the shadow self.
So it's not about embracing evil,
Right.
but rather confronting those aspects of ourselves that we fear or reject.
Exactly. Jung believed that the path to wholeness requires facing our darkest impulses,
Okay.
not out of some morbid fascination,
Right.
but because those very impulses hold the seeds of transformation.
It's like the old saying, the only way out is through.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
By integrating the shadow, we reclaim its energy and transform it into a source of creativity and vitality.
Right.
We actually see this theme echoed in many myths and stories throughout history.
Now that you mention it, I'm thinking about the story of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table.
Yeah.
They're all these noble heroes.
Right.
But they're constantly wrestling with their own inner demons.
Yeah.
And confronting the darker aspects of themselves.
Exactly. And ultimately, it's through those struggles that they achieve their greatest victories.
Okay.
It's not about being perfect or saintly.
Right.
It's about recognizing that we all have a shadow side, and that it's through confronting those aspects of ourselves that we become truly whole.
Okay, so we've talked about the shadow,
Yeah.
the animus, and the self.
Right.
But there's another piece of the puzzle that I'm really curious about,
Okay.
and that's the whole fish symbolism thing.
Sure.
I'm not sure if I fully grasped the connection between Christ fish and the concept of the self.
It is a fascinating connection.
Yeah.
And it gets to the heart of how Jung saw the interplay between individual psychology and universal archetypes. The fish for Jung was more than just a Christian symbol.
Right.
He traced it back to ancient mythology
Okay.
and saw it as a representation of the primordial waters of the unconscious.
So the fish becomes a symbol for the source of all creation,
Mm-hmm.
the wellspring from which our individual psyches emerge.
That's one way to interpret it.
Okay.
And remember, Jung also saw the unconscious as the realm of the self,
Right.
the totality of who we are, both conscious and unconscious.
Okay. I'm starting to see the connection here.
Yeah.
But what about Christ? How does he fit into this whole fish symbolism thing?
Well, for Christ was more than just a historical figure.
Right.
He was an archetype,
Okay.
a symbol for the self in its totality.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about the stories of Christ, he's constantly associated with water.
Right.
He's baptized in the Jordan River.
Hmm.
He walks on water.
Right. And in the early church, the fish symbol was often used as a secret sign among Christians.
Yeah.
It's like they were tapping into this deeper, more universal symbolism
Exactly.
that transcended their specific religious beliefs.
And that's what Jung was so interested in.
Right.
Those universal symbols that speak to the depths of the human psyche,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of our cultural or religious background.
This is all starting to make a lot more sense now.
Good.
But I have to ask, what does it all mean for us? How do we actually apply these concepts to our everyday lives?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer.
Right.
Because the journey of individuation is unique to each individual.
Okay. But I think the first step is simply becoming aware of these archetypal forces at play within us.
So it's about paying attention to our dreams, our fantasies,
Yeah.
our projections,
Right.
and noticing the patterns that emerge.
Exactly. And then once we start to recognize those patterns,
Yeah, okay.
we can begin to ask ourselves what they're trying to tell us.
Right.
What aspects of the self are seeking expression?
Mm-hmm.
What shadows are we trying to avoid?
Yeah.
What anima or animus qualities are we projecting onto others?
It sounds like a lifelong process of self-discovery and integration.
It is.
And I have a feeling we're just scratching the surface here.
We are. But that's the beauty of Jung's work.
Yeah.
It's an invitation to a lifelong journey of exploration and growth.
Right.
And who knows what treasures we might uncover along the way.
Speaking of treasures, you mentioned earlier that Jung saw a connection between the fish symbol and the alchemical concept of the lapis philosophorum.
Right.
Could you elaborate on that a bit? Absolutely. The lapis philosophorum, or philosopher's stone,
Okay.
was the ultimate goal of the alchemists.
Mm-hmm.
It was believed to be a substance that could transmute base metals into gold
Wow.
and grant immortality.
So it's like a magical elixir
Yeah.
that can transform everything it touches.
In a way, yes, but for Jung, the philosopher's stone wasn't a literal substance.
Okay.
It was a symbol for the self in its fully integrated state.
Mm-hmm.
It represented the culmination of the individuation process,
Okay.
the point at which we achieve wholeness and unity within ourselves.
And that's where the connection to the fish symbol comes in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just as the fish represents the primordial waters of the unconscious,
Right.
the lapis represents a crystallization of that potential,
Mm-hmm.
the emergence of the self from the depths of the unconscious.
Okay.
It's like the fish has leaped from the water and transformed into something entirely new, something precious and enduring.
That's a powerful image.
Yeah.
It's like the self is both the source and the culmination of our journey,
Mm.
the beginning and the end.
That's a beautiful way to put it, and it speaks to the cyclical nature of the individuation process.
Right.
It's not a linear progression,
Okay.
but rather a spiral that keeps circling back to the same core themes,
Yeah.
each time with greater depth and understanding.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been exploring some pretty deep waters with Carl Jung's concept of the self.
That's for sure.
Yeah. I feel like we've gone from dipping our toes in the shallows to swimming with some pretty profound fish symbolism.
Yeah, it's true. We've covered a lot of ground from the shadow self to the anima animus and these fascinating connections Jung makes between Christ the fish and the philosopher's stone.
You know, I'm really struck by this idea of the self as both a starting point and a destination.
Right.
It's like we're all born with this blueprint for wholeness,
Yeah.
but it takes a lifetime of exploration and integration to actually realize it.
It is a paradox, isn't it? We're both complete and incomplete at the same time. The potential for wholeness is always present. But it requires that conscious effort, and a willingness to confront our shadows to actually bring it into being.
That makes me think of the lapis, the philosopher's stone.
Yeah.
It's not something you just stumble upon.
Right.
It's the result of a long and arduous process of transformation.
Exactly. And that process is what Jung called individuation, the journey of becoming a unique and integrated individual. And it's not about conforming to societal expectations
Right.
or trying to be someone you're not.
Right.
It's about embracing the fullness of who you are, shadow and all.
But that's easier said than done right.
Yeah,
I mean, facing our shadow selves can be pretty scary.
it can be.
What advice would Jung give to someone who's just starting out on this journey of self-discovery?
I think he would emphasize the importance of cultivating a relationship with the unconscious.
Okay.
He saw the unconscious as this wise and guiding force,
Mhm.
constantly trying to communicate with us through our dreams, our intuitions, our synchronicities.
So it's about paying attention to those subtle messages and trying to decipher what they're telling us.
Exactly. And it's also about engaging in practices that help us access and integrate that wisdom of the unconscious, such as dream work, active imagination, and creative expression. It can be helpful to think of the unconscious as this vast and unexplored territory within ourselves. We need the right tools and a sense of adventure to navigate it effectively.
Right. It sounds like a lifelong adventure, really. There's always something new to discover about ourselves.
There is, and that's what makes the journey so exciting. It's not about reaching some final destination, but it's about the ongoing process of becoming.
This whole deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening for me. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of myself and the forces at play within my own psyche.
I'm so glad to hear that. I hope this exploration has inspired you to continue delving into Jung's ideas and to embark on your own journey of self-discovery.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up, there's one question that's been lingering in my mind.
Okay.
Jung suggests that the unconscious contains a blueprint for wholeness.
Right.
If that's true, how can we access and integrate that wisdom into our lives?
That's a profound question, and ultimately the answer is unique for each individual. But I believe it begins with a willingness to listen to the whispers of the unconscious, to face our shadows with courage, and to trust that the journey itself will reveal the way.
What a powerful message to end on. Thank you for guiding us through this deep dive into the world of Carl Jung. And to all our listeners, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the mysteries of the self.
Until next time.